American Monsters, The Morgan City Hag by Zalchin.
They tell me that the Morgan City Hag came on a boat with Los Fieros, a small group of Dominican immigrants who settled in the St. Mary parish of Louisiana. All boast that the fiend traveled on their very raft, but none of them can provide any evidence. And here's how they tell it. There are a dozen or more people per boat. Most of them are families of 4 or 5, sometimes children, sometimes grandparents or uncles or aunts. But one passenger, they say, travels alone. She is an elderly woman, with skin so pale, she glowed in the moonlight and hangs off her body like silk. The wrinkled woman never says a word the entire journey, just huddles in her tattered rags in the most shadow corner of the boat. The woman eats nothing, has brought no food or water or clothing, and when their raft runs ashore, she does not rejoice, she just stands and shuffles away into the trees. They all claim to have seen the Morgan City Hag firsthand, and the details of their stories are so similar that I have trouble not believing some of it is true. The Dominican community is a small one. Though tight-knit, it makes me wonder if they have rehearsed these tales for when outsiders come asking around. Talk of the Morgan City Hag's exploits takes place in dark bars and mystic voodoo huts. A local witch doctor claims to have one of the hag's shedded skins hanging in his sack. But it's hard to believe anyone who calls himself a witch doctor. But even the white locals claim to have come across large sheets of baggy and dried out skin hanging from branches in the swamps. And they find her victims too. Small animals and lost pets, the occasional child sucked dry of every ounce of their blood, curled up in paper white at the base of cypress trees. In the small towns, children will come up to you in the street and hold up their arms to show you their black and blue marks pressed into their skin. "Loup-garou, loup-garou," they exclaim, pointing to their bruises. There's a place a few miles into the swamp that the Dominican immigrants refuse to go. The whisper of black magic and devils. A brackish swamp surrounds a small hill where nothing grows apart from one gnarly, old silk cotton tree. It is here the locals claim that the Morgan City Hag speaks with demons and trades the blood of her victims for her powers. And once her magic is refreshed, she shoots across the sky like a fireball to hunt for her next victim. If you're ever in St. Mary's Parish, Louisiana, venture into the dark swamps. Wait for a night with no moon. Raft your way through the murky reeds by the light of the glowing foxglove. You may hear a lonely sobbing from the treetops. The Morgan City Hag is so far from home, you'll hear her hungry, groany circle around you. A flash of firelight blurs across the canopy of twisted cypress branches and disappears into the dark sky. Your boat will arrive at the base of a hill, bubbling up from the swamp water like a boil. Atop the hill is a white tree, ancient in size, its branches twisted like skeleton fingers, its roots bunched up like a coiled serpent at its base. Red candles burn in the night. A dry heat stings your cheeks. Devils whisper and bicker in the wind. They're bargaining for your blood. It's too late to turn back. Loup-garou, loup-garou. You'll remember the children's excited chanting. An old woman in rags emerges from behind the trees, sheds her skin in a threadbare blanket, stumbles towards you, a mass of shadow and bone. She thirsts for your blood, your skin, and your soul. The Morgan City Hag is not an American monster by birth, like so many of us. She's an immigrant lost in the land
of opportunity.
What was it? The following is a story from my childhood that I'm never going to forget. Growing up, I lived in Louisiana. I have moved out of state since, but it's always going to have a special place in my heart. Now, I grew up in the very swampy / heavily forested area. I loved being there, to be honest. Yes, you're away from everyone, but you're very much in with nature, A lot of people have asked me, did I not miss seeing other people? The thing is, well, no. To be honest with you, I was used to being with nature anyway. If I did have people come up, it is kind of a strange thing anyway. We would even see tourists sometimes, but we just got used to it and waved to them. So my story takes place on one summer's day. My dad wanted to go and visit his brother. I absolutely loved my uncle. Now he lived quite away from us. His house was somewhat secluded, to say the very least. My dad actually got worried about him living in such isolation that he made a good point to go and visit him a lot. You could tell that he was always happy to have guests over. He was actually older than my dad. He was relatively elderly when I knew him. He sadly passed away and I'm always gonna miss him. So, like normal, we went to visit him, and to be honest, we had an absolute wow of a time. He cooked us up some really cool meats and I just loved it. As night fell, we all went to go on his porch and he began telling stories to us. My dad knew most of the stories, and to be honest, I'm not sure how many of them were real, but I love listening to them. Thinking of it now, my dad was obviously in on this, but he just liked the fact that my uncle was able to keep me so interested. I always wondered why my dad kept smiling when my uncle was telling these stories. After eating the rest of the food, we eventually made our way to his house. Now, down the back of where he lived, there was a very small cabin that he let guests stay in. My dad was adamant that we stayed in that cabin, but my uncle wouldn't let him. He said that there's no way he could have guests over, especially not family, and not let them stay with him. They had a conversation for a while about this. In the end, we just went inside to watch some TV and some old VHS movies. Again, I really enjoyed this. Now, my uncle went off to bed and said his goodbyes to us. My dad then nudged me. Hey, we're gonna go out to that cabin. Come on, it's only fair. To be fair, I didn't really want to go into the cabin. I got really creepy vibes off it, but I couldn't go against my dad's order over my uncle's. My uncle was a very heavy sleeper due to his elderly age, so we just very quietly opened the back door and began the very small trek to get to the cabin. My dad made especially sure that he shut the door as quietly as he could as to not wake my uncle. My uncle had some very big dogs too, but somehow they managed to stay asleep as well. One of them did wake up for a moment, but after he recognised who it was, he just went back to sleep too. So there we were, in the moonlight, walking through the forested area to go and get to this cabin. As we were walking, I had this very eerie feeling. I can't describe exactly what it was, but something just felt off. It was almost as if we were being watched by the darkness, if that makes sense. We could see some of the rivers illuminated by the moonlight, but it was still very hard to walk. I did, however, manage to put on a brave face as we continued down towards a cabin. Every time we walked though, I would get this stronger and stronger feeling like something was off. Suddenly, we heard a load of branches snapping, almost like they were following us. Me and my dad then immediately stopped to try and see what animal it was making these sounds at us. We heard nothing. We waited for a little bit to try and let our eyes adjust into the darkness more, so that way we could try and figure out just what was making this sound. After a few more seconds of nothing went past, my dad said, "It's probably just an animal, son. Don't worry about it. I'm sure we'll be fine. Plus we're armed anyway." I guess he was right, but I always remembered how paranoid I felt at this. It was almost like there was something just off about this situation. We were very close to the cabin now, so I began to feel a little bit more easy than I did earlier. As we walked, my dad made me stay back a little. Now, I was sure something was wrong. Why did he look so cautious about going into the cabin? There was nothing to fear, right? My dad then immediately froze in his tracks. He turned back and looked at me. His face had suddenly went very pale and he almost looked cold. He ushered for me to be quiet and he slowly went to look round the back of the cabin. He suddenly come jogging back from round the other side very cautiously. "Dad, what's going on? You're scaring me." "Shh, son, be quiet. It's very important you don't make a sound now, okay?" "Okay, Dad, but what?" "Shh." My dad then grabbed my hand and we began to jog towards the house. The dog started going mental too. I have no idea what was going on. I was asking my dad to explain to me what he had seen, but he never told me. We just jogged to the door. As we got there, my uncle suddenly slammed it open. "Why did you go down there? I told you not to," he said, as he had his gun in one hand and was trying desperately to hold back the dogs with another. "Quickly, get inside, son." My dad then pushed me to the side and made sure that I actually stayed within the house. His brother then handed him another gun and they all went out with flashlights. "Don't open that door, okay?" I was truly scared at this point. I didn't want to be left alone in the house, but I was so scared of what was up in that cabin. I didn't want my dad or uncle to get hurt. Suddenly, I could hear the sounds of the dogs barking and rushing off into the distance. Then, it was followed by the sounds of furious splashing. It sounded like a fully grown man was splashing about into the water. I then heard a gunshot into the air. It made me jump. I couldn't tell if they had shot anyone or they had been shot at, but I know it terrified me. Suddenly, there was silence again. I couldn't hear anything for what felt like an eternity. I was just so scared. I began shaking, sitting there waiting for my dad and uncle to return. Eventually, I did hear the sound of the dogs rushing back towards the door. I quickly opened it and let them in against my dad's orders. The dogs rushed in and went to hide under the table. I could see how scared they had gotten. Eventually, my uncle did return and so did my dad. As they come, they both had cold sweat on their heads. I could see that something was very wrong. Now I did ask them desperately to tell me what happened, but all they told me to do was go to bed and lock the doors. Now, I was left in the dark about that for years. It was only when I asked my dad recently about what had happened he decided it was time to tell me. The following are his words. "Son, you want to know what actually happened that day? I love you very much and I'm always going to protect you." As I got to that cabin, I could see that there was somebody who had broken in. The back window was completely missing. The reason I stopped was I could see there was something in the water. At first, I thought it was a gator. I then decided to shine my flashlight to see the glowing eyes back at me, but I didn't see anything. What I saw might have even been more scary. It was a canoe. I then gone back in to get your uncle so we could go out to investigate. That's why the dogs began going mental. What we found in there was so scary to me. My brother went round the back as I held up at the front door. The dogs were going mental trying to get in, but your uncle managed to stop them barking for a little bit. I was getting ready to bust the door in. "On three," I called out. Then, I suddenly heard my brother call back. "Put your hands up where you are now and I won't blow your brains out." I quickly rushed round the side to see just what was happening. Staring back at us, there was a crazy looking demented old man. He had a big knife on him. He had this crazed look in his eye. We tried to talk to him but he was purely talking gibberish. He began edging towards my brother and that was when I fired my gun in the air and he instantly hesitated back. We tried talking in this guy but we couldn't get anything out of him. We were thinking of calling the police but my brother told him that he's got 5 seconds to get out of here. It was like it didn't even faze him. He just casually opened the door and started walking round to the side. He still had the knife in hand. The thing that doesn't make any sense though is that The second he heard one of the dogs bark, he began instantly sprinting towards the freezing cold water, got back into his boat as quickly as possible, and then disappeared into the darkness. But the thing I have never understood is, why on earth was he not scared by the people saying they were about to shoot him? It was almost like he wasn't fazed by humans whatsoever. And the thing I don't understand is, what on earth was he doing up there? What were his intentions? What would have happened to us if I hadn't have gone up there with my uncle and you had opened the door first? And that's what my dad told me. I hate to think what could have happened had either myself or my dad went to that door first, or just what was wrong with that man. After he disappeared into the darkness, that was the last that me, my dad, or my uncle ever saw of him. After that incident, my uncle quickly got that whole cabin torn down and a very large fence erected. Scariness in a Swamp by Michael Pink Wayne.
I worked at a summer camp in North Carolina. We are on a swamp and we sometimes go canoeing in the swamp. To get to the canoe, we have to walk along this half a mile or so path. Me and a couple of buddies decided to go canoeing at night for fun. We walked down the path. It's kinda creepy, but it was a nice night, so it was fine. When we get to the platform with the canoe, we heard a splash in the swamp pretty far off. The splash just wasn't as big as someone jumping in the water, but it was pretty big. Think throwing a 30 or 40 pound rock in the water. It was a little weird, but we didn't think much of it. We started canoeing and we heard another splash. Same size, but a little bit closer. We kept hearing the splash every 5 to 10 minutes, and it's clearly following us. Just to paint a picture, it was pitch black and we had flashlights and we were trying to shine it around, but we didn't see anything. There's land all around the swamp, but it's really thick with trees, thorns, poison ivy, and etc. It's possible, though very difficult, to walk along it. But we didn't hear anything moving, and it would be pretty much impossible to walk along without making any noise. We didn't hear anything other than the splashes. As far as I know, there aren't any animals in the area that could make that sort of splash. No beavers, no gators, or anything like that. At some point, the splashes stop for like 15 to 20 minutes, and we think it's done. Then there's one about 10 feet away from our canoe, so we book it back to the platform. On the platform, there's a little girl's backpack filled with the little girl's clothes, underwear included. That was not there when we got there the first time. There wasn't anyone missing from our camp, in case anybody's wondering. Anyway, takes the cake as the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. The walk back along the path, I kept expecting someone, or something, to grab me.
Being Marched into the Swamp by Baby Bancroft. This all happened at a secluded lake cabin in deep South Texas owned by my parents around 20 years ago. Now, I mean this was very secluded. It was maybe 40 minutes to the nearest highway, so 40 minutes away from the nearest town, but that only had a population of 800, and it was well over an hour to the nearest city of any size. The last 4 miles or so were down a washed out but public dirt road. The road did a tight turn around directly in front of our cabin, as ours was the last one accessible by it. On one side of the road there was a cliff. The other side was our cabin. There was then maybe a tract of grass that was 80 foot wide to the water edge or pier, etc. Next to the pier was a patch of dense woods, maybe 2 acres deep, then a swampy area going next to the cabin. It was kinda scary. It all created kind of a funneled area to a dead end. We had been there for weeks at a time and not even seen any other life. Most of the other cabins that were around us, in fact, were actually completely abandoned. This night, we headed into the city to go shopping. We ended up making a night of it. By the time we got back to the cabin, it was 4 AM. The windows of the cabin had these big wooden shutters flapped down over the windows from outside. Knowing that everybody wanted to sleep in, I went to pull them to keep the early sun out. I then went back inside and everybody was ready to sleep. The sleeping quarters were all in one big room. Now altogether there were 6 adults and 2 teens this night. I finished with the shutters, made sure everybody was ready for bed and turned out all of the lights. Strangely, after less than 5 minutes later, I could see headlights coming around the bend of our road. It was very obvious since it was so dark outside. I mean, you've got to think, there weren't any street lights or anything around, so it's pretty dark. We all just thought that this was probably fishermen coming up to launch a boat, as would sometimes happen. The van then got to the turnaround point, spun around as if to leave the same way they had come, and then stopped. When they didn't immediately turn around to leave, I got up to look out of the window that the end of the building had. My big, tough, mostly nosy firefighter uncle soon joined me. My dad then made sure that the guns were ready just in case. We were fully expecting them to start messing with my uncle's truck, or attempting to take some of the stuff from the bed of his truck, but clearly, that was not their intent. There was enough moonlight and light from their parking lights to see that there was an adult man getting out of the van with 2 young children. The driver then backed and went down the private road for the last house. He parked and got out with 2 long poles. My uncle and I had several discussions as to whether these were sticks or rifles. He then handed one to the other guy. The men were both dressed appropriately for the weather. It was cold and they had long pants and jackets. For the kids, they were just wearing light pajamas with no shirts. By this time, both the kids were audibly crying. The men started leading both children into the woods and down the swampy area, holding them each by the arm. At this point, we were flipping out and trying to decide exactly what to do. Props to my uncle for his quick thinking. He used the panic button to set off his truck alarm. Suddenly, the van started up and frantically pulled out of the driveway. The men and boys jumped into the van and tore off down the road. We all looked out the windows as best we could. We couldn't see very much considering the shutters. We tried our best to get a description of the van, but only managed a very vague general description. This being a long time ago, my mum was the only one with a cell phone. We knew that it only worked at the very end of the pier, so myself, my uncle, and dad each took a gun and made the long trek out there to dial 911. We were frantically pointing the guns around at any sound. The rest of them held down the fort for us. After fumbling around for a while, we finally managed to get through to the police. Unfortunately, they never caught anyone. The time I was a madman in the woods for a Troubadour 222. So most of my life, I had been a land surveyor in Florida. That means I go out to measure the land for legal and economic reasons. I had lived in Florida all my life, and Central Florida has some pretty wild and undeveloped places in it. I grew up in the swamps and woods of Florida. I then worked there for more than 30 years. So we are contracted to survey 5 or 6 sections of land. A section is about a square mile of land that is dictated by one of the first acts of the first US Congress. This is known as the Ohio Land Act. So anyway, this was during the 1980s. I loved my work. I spent all my time working in the wildlands of Florida. When you measured large tracts of land like that back in the pre-GPS days, you had to clear the property lines, and then it involved those tracts called sections. These are the square mile tracts of land. This meant that you had to open up the property lines and go through the swamps and woods with machetes and chainsaws by hand. It could literally take weeks at a time to do a job like that. And to give you more perspective, I was a supervisor and kind of known in my community for being a wild man, though it was more style than reality. I wore a foot-long beard. Because most of my job meant using a machete in waist-deep swamps, I would always wear my oldest clothes, which were pretty ragged up and beaten. So one day while working, we finally broke through alongside of a brand spanking new orange tree grove that had newly planted trees. I saw a guy on a tractor and a guy taking sapling orange trees off of a trailer and planting them. I decided the best thing to do was let these guys know what I was doing. Just what you do when you go over to other people's land for a living. So here I am, in clothes with big holes in them, a foot-long beard, loose long hair that the wind blown into a mess, carrying a machete that had clear signs of being sharpened. I watched both of them tense up and go stiff. I had just climbed over the fence and was obviously going to where they were standing. I stopped and thought and decided that maybe I should leave my machete, so I stuck it into the ground. I watched the guy in the tractor relax once this happened. As I started walking up towards them, they both become even less tense. As I got there, I realized that we all knew each other. The guy on the tractor was a school teacher who had been my elementary PE coach, and his cousin was planting. The guy had actually graduated high school with me. As we got talking, I could see just how distressed they were from seeing me previously. They then told me that they had never been more frightened in their life. It turns out that they were armed with a .357 in a belt holster. They were 1 second away from shooting me just before I put my machete in the ground and it made them stop. They had never in living memory seen anybody come out of the swamp like that. They were convinced that I was some madman about to kill them, and they were prepared to shoot me to survive. I'm just thankful that I realized that they were on edge and I put my machete into the ground. Who knows what could have happened if I had have continued walking towards them.